Thanks, Tim. I'm trying to think of a joke that's boxing related that doesn't involve blood and guts. But what maybe I'll just do is I'll just touch on Tim's last point in his presentation, and we'll have some images just running in the background as I speak. The beautiful forest and what it means to us all, and kind of the benefits that we're getting out of it, and some of the history of the conflict that happened leading up to the agreement as well. Tim made the point that this it's sort of like a roadmap that we've created, that it isn't a done deal, that land use decisions haven't been made, and I think that's really important for us to get across, is that there is a lot more work to be done, and we actually haven't, circled up areas on maps, and legislation hasn't changed yet, and regulation hasn't been improved, and we actually haven't done a lot of shopping of our proposals and solutions to First Nations governments and provincial governments, but we're building towards that, and that was the goal of the agreement from the beginning. I think it's also important to recognize that, as Tim said, we didn't get here overnight. It's been a long time that we've been discussing, arguing, fighting over the boreal forest and what it means to the different parties, the forest industry, communities, First Nations, environmental organizations. And it's taken us a long time to get here, and I think next time around we'd hopefully get here sooner, but I think it's important to recognize some of the history that got us to May 2010 when we actually signed the agreement, and has actually helped us move along in the last 15 months since the agreement's been launched. As Tim mentioned, more than 10 years, there's been more than 10 years of environmental organizations campaigning on the boreal forest. Many groups who have been locally based, who have been working on provincial forest issues, even national forest issues, species at risk, climate change, protected areas. And a lot of this work was being done to bring attention to what was actually happening on the ground, bringing attention not only here to the Canadian public, but also globally, because the forest sector is selling products all over the world. We had examples of campaigning like 1,500 eminent scientists signed letters to provincial governments asking them to do more to protect the boreal forest, organized by the Canadian Boreal Initiative and the Pew Environment Group. We had probably about 24, if not more, science reports that were coordinated by groups like Greenpeace and the Nature Conservancy, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. We had those high-profile do not buy and boycott campaigns as well. So in those campaigns, we were focusing in on the companies and what products they were selling in the marketplace, and looking at their customers and asking their customers to try to motivate and push for change. And you'll see some of the images up behind me of what those campaigns look like. And those implicated big customers of the forest product sector in Canada, companies like Office Depot, Rona, Kimberly-Clark, Limited Brands, Simon & Schuster, Indigo Books. These are all companies that were involved in the story that we were telling about the boreal forest and what it means and how it's needing further protection. And I think as a result of these do not buy campaigns and these boycott campaigns, we began to see business shifting around. So we had companies who were actually cutting their ties with some of the companies who were part of the Forest Products Association and moving their business elsewhere, because they didn't want to be associated with the controversy that organizations like Greenpeace and Forest Ethics and others were raising in the newspaper, in their ads, in the protests that they were doing in the forests or in downtown Toronto and that sort of thing. And while this is all going on, we were seeing a big shift in the global marketplace for forest products. So an actual acceleration of the greening of the forest products marketplace, where literally we have hundreds of companies now who have passed policies that are setting standards for the products that they want to buy that go over and above provincial government regulation, that go over and above what was currently being practiced by many of the companies who are part of the association. So they're also driving demand for change on the ground. And I think that was an important component of the story leading up to the agreement. So when we were designing these campaigns, and I'll give you a bit of insight into how we work as an organization, Greenpeace, we quickly came to the realization that many people in Canada didn't actually know what the boreal forest was. They had this concept that there was a big forest across the country, the great wilderness of Canada. Most people, if you ask them, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, what's the boreal forest, they would look at you blankly, maybe excuse you, or quickly run away because they thought you were saying weird Latin words and that sort of thing, Aurora Borealis. But most people didn't know that there were products that they were using on a daily basis that were coming out of the boreal forest. And so when we were designing the campaigns that we needed to bring out to raise awareness about the boreal forest, we tried to associate those campaigns around products that people were using on a daily basis. So we looked at products like toilet paper and facial tissue and lingerie magazines and junk mail and copy paper and books. And these are all products that people were using on a nearly daily basis. And we began to educate people about these products and where they were coming from. And some of the slogans of the campaigns were things like wiping away ancient forests, in reference to toilet paper and tissue products, and Victoria's Dirty Secret, talking about the lingerie magazines and catalogs that were being produced off of out of boreal forests, and photocopying forest destruction, referring to photocopy paper that's being made by some unsustainable practices in the boreal forest. Part of the story as well was getting media attention to the issue. So if you go back into the media records 10 years ago, not much mention of the boreal forest, virtually unknown what was happening to woodland caribou across the country. And a lot of the work that we were doing was about raising that kind of awareness through things like protests and these do not buy campaigns and the blockades that were happening in the forest as well. And it really was a situation where I think we were very polarized, the forest industry and the environmental organizations. And it was very much, the debate was framed up as either you can protect the environment or you can keep the forest industry running. You could save caribou or you could save jobs. And there wasn't much middle ground that we were finding. And that was the debate that was going on as we got into the fall of 2008, when we began to think about doing something different. While this is also going on, the forest industry has been in flux over the last decade or so. There's been increasingly global competition from places like South America, China, and that sort of thing. High cost of the Canadian dollar, a slump in the US housing market, driving down demand for lumber products from the Canadian marketplace, a drop in the newsprint sector as well. So a lack of diversification amongst the industry, which has been changing quite quickly over the last few years under the leadership of Avram. And so this created the perfect storm to create the right space and the right time to have a dialogue to do things differently. And that's what brought us together. People ask me, why are you part of this type of agreement? And I say to them, it's because we need to do something different if we're going to make substantial change on the ground. Separately, environmental organizations and even the forest industry don't have a lot of power to make change on the ground. We don't control legislative bodies. We have a small amount of influence on government, though we like to lobby hard and advocate hard. But separately, our influence is much less than if we are united and together. And for us, I think joining forces with the forest industry has been the real impetus of the agreement. The real drive to get the agreement done was to actually bring our forces together, see if we could craft solutions that would work for both parties, and also together go to governments, provincial governments and First Nations governments, and ask them to modify land use on the ground as well. And I think the Boreal Agreement is a real example of private sector interests and civil society coming together to begin to craft solutions to some of the land use problems that all governments across the country are facing right now. And so we're actually the ones who are stepping up here to begin to address some of the problems that Ontario's facing, that the federal government's facing, that provinces like Alberta are facing around one form of resource use. And I think it presents an opportunity to be a model to other industries as well. When we sat down at the table for the first time in 2008, we were literally talking a different language. We actually had to hire a paid mediator or our translator to come in and translate between both sides and allow us to be able to talk to each other. Because we had been we've been battling it out for so long in the war in the woods that Avram was talking one language, I was talking another language, and we weren't seeing eye to eye on where our interests lined up. And so it was really important having that mediation there and that facilitation there. I think also part of the success of the agreement and the reason why we got to agreement in May of 2010 was because we spent so much time in rooms together in hotels near airports that we began to build trust with each other. And we began to see beyond the positions of the parties who were sitting at the table, and we began to see each other as people. And that's, I think, one of the real lessons of the agreement is that you know, organizations may have their interests, and those interests need to be filled, but behind those interests are people. And those people are, you know, is where the responsibility lies in terms of crafting things like the Boreal Agreement. Some have accused me and my organization of doing a deal with the devil and selling out the environmental community and selling out in wilderness in Canada. And you know, it's a hard thing to hear, especially when many years ago, we saw Avram as the devil. He was a great rallying point for the troops at Greenpeace and getting the activists out to do protests outside of Abitibi-Bowater's headquarters. You know, we would put up Avram on the wall in the war room at Greenpeace, and it was a great dartboard, and we had a lot of fun with it. But now, you know, we have a very different relationship, Avram and I. We go for walks along the waterfront. Sometimes we hold hands. We do yoga together. We don't hold hands, but we do yoga together, and that's come about because of the amount of time that we spent together and the trust that we've been able to build together to create an agreement that needs to happen, that needed to happen at the time. We couldn't keep battling it out like we had been battling it out for a decade without seeing any real substantial change on the ground. I think when it comes down to it, you know, the old paradigm of jobs versus the environment has to come to an end. It's come to an end, I think, with the Boreal Agreement, and you know, the success of the Boreal Agreement will rest on whether we're able to actually come up with solutions that work for both the forest companies and many of the communities that depend on the forest industry, and also for the environment as well. We want to save caribou. We need to save caribou. We need to look at protecting endangered species across the boreal forest. We need to look at increasing the protected areas network in the boreal forest. But we also need to do it in such a way that we can continue to cut trees and send trees to mills and continue to have people working in those mills and selling their products all around the world. We've never done it on this scale, as Tim said. We've done it in places on smaller scales in the Amazon, in Finland, in the Great Bear Rainforest, in British Columbia. I think we are ambitious with this agreement, but ambition is what really drives change, and if we didn't have ambitious people, then we wouldn't have the great country that we have today. So, you know, I think if there's anybody who's going to do it on this scale, it's going to be this group of people. Just to kind of in closing, I'll just give you a quick update on where we're at with things. We've begun to do phase 1 project work. So basically we have groups, working groups who have been set up in Quebec, right across the country, but particularly in Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta, who are meeting and sitting at tables and looking at, beginning to look at maps and data and figures, looking at what kind of wood supply is needed to keep mills running, how many trees we need to keep standing to protect caribou and to save other species. And this is covering an area of about 13 million hectares in this first phase of the work that we're doing. We have a number of local First Nations communities that have joined us in this conservation planning, and I think we're quite excited about that. Ultimately, it's First Nations communities at the local level who do have decision-making power over their traditional territories, and we need to obviously have them involved in the conservation planning process that we're undertaking. We've hosted 2 meetings of the Boreal Business Forum, and the Boreal Business Forum is a really an interesting group. It's a group of about 12 companies who buy large amounts of forest products from the Canadian forest sector. They represent about $150 billion worth of equity, and they've met twice already to learn about progress under the agreement, to support the agreement, to give us that moral support, and hopefully as well they'll be the ones who continue to keep our feet to the fire in terms of making progress. And we have our next meeting coming up with them in November in Toronto. We've created a secretariat, which has been staffed up. We actually have our newest executive director, who's just been hired in the room back there, Andrew Bevan. We've also hired a new chair to chair the meetings of the steering committee, which is the core group of negotiators of the agreement, Mr. Monty Hummel, who many of you know from the World Wildlife Fund. He's going to be chairing our meetings. So we're quite excited about the staffing that we have created jointly. We have an independent science advisory team, and I think this is quite important as well, is that in the past we've had the NGOs have had scientists and the industry have scientists, and we battle it out in the public sphere. But in this case, under the agreement, we've hired independent scientists who are advising us on the types of products that we need to produce at the local level, and using the best and latest available science to inform the kinds of decisions that we need to make. And I think that's a real interesting component of the agreement. And we're also made progress in terms of drafting up the forest practices that we want to see on the ground. So we're reviewing those forest practices right now and beginning to look at how to bridge the gap between the type of forestry that's currently being practiced and the type of forestry we'd like to see in the future. We do have challenges, though. No agreement is perfect. We have many people who are working across the country on the agreement. And the people who are working on the agreement are not always the same people who negotiated the agreement. So they don't have the benefit of working in hotel rooms and boardrooms for the last 2 years, negotiating, building trust, building up a relationship, and understanding each other's language. So the core negotiators of the agreement are having to do a lot of work to translate that trust and translate that solutions mindset to these working groups that are happening right across the country. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is resourcing. You can't do this agreement for free. It's not a free deal, and it takes money to get people to meetings, and it takes money to run data and run analyses. And so a lot of the work that we're facing right now is funding for the agreement. So acquiring the funding from the philanthropic community, from provincial and the federal government to help support our work. And this is, I think, a key component. If we have the capacity to do the agreement, then the agreement has a much greater chance of succeeding. There's the goodwill to do it, but we also need the people power to do it as well. So I'll just kind of finish on that note. I think with the agreement, we have an opportunity to conserve vast areas of forest. I think we have an opportunity to save the forest industry. We have an opportunity to create more vibrant and prosperous communities, and we have the will to do it. And it's been a long slog over the last decade to get us here, but I think I have a lot of hope for what we'll be able to accomplish over the coming year or so. I'll turn it over to Avram.